I want to welcome everyone. I'm Carrie Hauser, president of Colorado Mountain College, and we are delighted to have you here today. This is another featured conversation in our speakers series, furthering our commitment to and theme to building bridges to common ground. I want to thank internally our ILT team, to Richard Gonzalez, and to so many that are really working hard on our DEI efforts. I will add our expansion efforts as well, if you've read my most recent column. I also want to just flag that we will, as we have in past conversations, follow this up with an internal faculty and staff coffee and conversations, which is scheduled for Friday, April 16th at 2 p.m. And we hope you will join us. We certainly welcome members of the public with us today. So today our speaker is Ajit Pai, and he brings to CMC a wealth of experience from his service for 2 presidential administrations, and he's graciously agreed to share his story and to mostly engage in discussion with you. So we're going to reserve as much time as we can for that. As we were sort of in the green room, we were visiting a little bit, and I was really interested to hear one of the things that Ajit is most proud of, and it was work he did on a national suicide prevention number similar to 911. One day when there is the opportunity to dial 988, that will really be one of Ajit's legacies. So maybe he'll tell us a little bit more about that in his conversation. But I want to hand this off to a friend of Ajit, who is our very own internal Dr. Matt Gianeschi. The two of them have a history together, and we're so glad that we have some friends in good places to join us and to become part of the Colorado Mountain College family. So Ajit, we look forward to having you out in Colorado someday in person, or back in Colorado someday in person, and I will go off screen and look forward to the conversation. So Matt, turn it to you.
Thanks, Carrie. Momentarily, it'll be my privilege to introduce Ajit formally, and I'll read his bio so that we make sure that I don't miss any of the appropriate details. But as Carrie mentions, Ajit and I, 10 years ago, I had the privilege to spend the better part of a summer in Europe with Ajit and explore a number of different economies and democracies, and to really understand a lot of, frankly, about America in the context of learning about other countries and what our own experience has been. It's a privilege to call Ajit a friend, and watching his career over the years has been extraordinary. He is absolutely one of the smartest people that I know. And without question, one of the funniest people. He's the one you want at a cocktail party or a dinner event, when that is permissible again. But as Carrie mentioned, we were both Marshall Fellows, and I mentioned to Ajit that our own Jen Barchers will soon be a Marshall Fellow of her own, on her own right. And so we'll have the opportunity to hear from her eventually. A few logistical details. Shortly, we'll turn it over to Ajit, allow him to give his own background, tell a bit about his story, tell his story. But we're leaving plenty of room toward the end, so there should be 30 to 40 minutes potentially for questions to come in. And so we invite everyone who is participating to share those questions with us through the chat. We will do our best to make sure that we are sharing those with Ajit and giving enough time to cover as much ground as possible. We do have a couple of topics that we want to cover, but that will be the opportunity for everybody to share those questions with us, including, especially if there are students who are on this webinar. We strongly invite you to maybe even let us know that you're a student in the chat, so that we can prioritize some of your questions for our speaker today. So without further ado, Ajit Pai was the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission from January 2017 until January 2021. He was designated chairman by President Donald Trump in January of 2017, and previously served as a commissioner at the FCC appointed by then President Barack Obama. Little side note, an editorial note, I was with Ajit. We were down in I was mentioned to him, we were in the hotel lobby in a or in the lobby of a maybe two-star hotel in Budapest, Hungary, in working on email late into the evening one night when the invitation from President Obama's office came. And so my little brush with fame with Ajit was that I was sitting there working on my own email when he received the invitation from President Obama. He was confirmed unanimously by the US Senate in March 2012. Earlier in his career, he served in various positions of increasing responsibility at the FCC, the United States Department of Justice, and the US Senate. Before becoming an FCC commissioner, he worked as a partner in the law firm of Jenner and Block and served as an in-house counsel at a telecommunications company. Chairman Pai graduated with honors from Harvard University in 1994 and from the University of Chicago Law School in 1997. Ajit is the son of immigrants from India, and he grew up in Parsons, Kansas, and now lives in the Washington, D.C. area. So without further ado, it is a privilege to introduce my good friend and an extraordinary American, Ajit Pai. Ajit, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that very warm introduction. You know, it's been almost 10 years since we traipsed through Europe together, and the friendships that you and I and others in our group formed are friendships that endure to this day. One of my favorite poets of all time, Emily Dickinson, once said that my friends are my estate. And as I get older, I certainly find that to be true, that those friendships that were formed in places like Europe through the Marshall Memorial Fellowship have been what have really sustained me, along with my family, of course, over the last 10 years. I also want to extend my gratitude to Dr. Hauser and to the entire Colorado Mountain College team for allowing me to participate today. And Dr. Hauser, a tip of the cap to you as well. As a former CEO of sorts, I know what a challenge it has been during the COVID-19 pandemic to ensure that students across CMC, as well as employees across Colorado, are able to participate and succeed. And you've done that in spades. I saw that recently you've graduated more students than you ever have in the past. And that's a testament to your leadership and the dedication of your employees. I also want to thank everybody else at CMC that's helped put this together behind the scenes, Richard Gonzalez, Debbie Novak, and so many others. I know that it's not easy to do. And so I just want to thank you again for your dedication and hospitality. To those of you who are watching as well, Matt gave you a brief sketch about my professional background, and his was, of course, the more charitable telling. My mother would tell you that I should have gone to medical school in the first place, and I can't keep a job, which is why I'm now in my 9th or 10th job out of law school. But I thought I'd give you a little bit more flavor about where I come from and why I think the way I do. My parents came to the United States 50 years ago, this next month, as a matter of fact, in 1971 to Buffalo, New York, and I was born there in 1973. When my parents came, they had literally $8, a transistor radio, and just a belief that the American dream would be within reach, even though they didn't really know anybody, didn't have any connections and that sort of thing. Ultimately, we moved to a very small town in Kansas, southeast Kansas, called Parsons, which is about 3 hours south of Kansas City, 2 hours southeast from Wichita, 2 hours northeast from Tulsa. It's all of which would say it's pretty far out there. And so I know what it's like growing up in rural America. One of the things I used to do as a kid in the 80s, and this is perhaps a testament to my dorkiness as well as the lack of communications technologies back then, but I used to watch C-SPAN, and I used to watch these senators and representatives and administration officials give speeches and do events. And one of the things I noticed is that there was never anyone that really looked like me. And I sometimes wondered, well, is that something that I might be able to do someday? And I didn't have a plan. Didn't even have a plan to have a plan. But what I did have was this sort of burning ambition to do something, to be somebody, maybe be a pioneer in my own right. And I was very fortunate, having grown up through Kansas, to be introduced to things like speech and debate. And I was a violinist in the orchestra and had all of these different things that ultimately it made me appreciate that there's a much wider world out there that I wanted to be a part of. Through some luck, I ended up at Harvard for undergrad and ended up just studying a bunch of different subjects and being intrigued with the humanities, which led me to law school at the University of Chicago. And then after law school, worked for a year in New Orleans for a federal judge. And I remember very vividly sitting down with my judge who was a friend of Walter Isaacson, who was a friend of the CMC, of course. And as the judge was asking me what I wanted to do after the clerkship was over in the fall of 1998, I said, yeah, I'm not really sure, but yeah, I really am interested in antitrust litigation. I just want to be in Washington. There's something about the energy of that place that I want to be able to tap into. And he recommended I apply to the honors program at the Department of Justice. And I did, somehow got in, and have been in Washington ever since. And I certainly would not say that my job trajectory has been linear. I think there's some people out there who tend to be planners. They know what they're going to do for the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 20 years. And I thought I was going to be like that, but my dad gave me a good piece of advice just before I moved to Washington, which was just don't think of yourself as necessarily having to stick to a plan. If you find a good opportunity, if a door opens, then be willing to take the risk and walk through it. I'm really glad he gave me that advice, because over my career, there have been a number of different jumps to different agencies, different sectors, and each of them has been really rewarding and has enabled me to sort of fill in a piece of the puzzle, so to speak, in terms of my own skill set or aptitude and the like. So when Matt happened to see me that very evening in May of 2011, when we were sitting there in that Budapest hotel, it was a really gratifying moment to know that the most powerful person in the world, President Obama, had tapped me, or was going to tap me soon for that really important position. And in that moment, I still remember when the formal nomination papers came out, calling my parents. And it was one of the few times I've heard my dad in particular become very emotional, because for him, this was the sign that anything was possible. They'd come here with, as I said, a radio, a few dollars in cash, and just this belief in the dream. And within one generation, here their son was being tapped for this important position. And for me, at least, it's always given me a sense of responsibility to be worthy of the sacrifices that my parents have made, to be worthy of the support that I've gotten from the Indian American community, and also it's a responsibility to everybody, from those who I've grown up with in rural Kansas, to my classmates in college and law school, and most importantly, of course, writ large, to the American people. So that brings me to the FCC itself. It's an incredible agency. For those of you who've had the chance to study it, I'm sure you know that it has a very broad jurisdiction, but for those of you who haven't, the Federal Communications Commission was established in 1934 by President Roosevelt to govern the communications marketplace. And in the original days, that meant things like AM radio, the inception of TV, a couple decades later, the introduction of satellite TV and cable. And in the modern times, it's involved the technologies we use every day, wireless, satellite, wireless internet, you name it. And so it's a really exciting place to be. And one of the things I found when I became the commissioner or the chairman of the FCC is that when you're in that corner office and you're technically in charge of over 1,400 people, there's a lot of pressure that comes with that job. Number one, you have to come up with what your strategy is going to be. What do you want to achieve with the time that you are given? And for me, at least, there are a few things that are really important. Growing up in rural Kansas, I was keenly aware, even when I went back home, when I went to visit my parents in the dirt road outside of Parsons where we lived, that there wasn't sufficient internet access, if there was internet access at all. And closing that digital divide, as it's called, that gap between those Americans who have access to the internet and those who don't, was really important to me. The second one was encouraging more innovation. One of the things that technology has done over the last couple of decades is made our lives immeasurably easier or better in certain ways. It's hard to remember it because we live in, of course, in the day-to-day, but for me, at least, as a kid of the 70s and 80s, communications technologies meant essentially 3 channels on a broadcast TV, on my broadcast TV, a wired telephone that was lunky and was connected to the wall. And that was pretty much it in terms of my connections to the outside world. And of course, our hometown AM radio station, KLKC. Fast forward to today, and it's just astonishing to me that over one of these devices, you can connect to pretty much anyone in the world and do pretty much anything you want. But it follows from that the more dependent our lives are on technology, the more important it is that everyone has access to that technology. And so we rolled out a whole bunch of different initiatives during my time at the FCC to make sure that everyone was able to benefit from it. One of them that might be of interest to CMC students, especially those in some of the more farther flung areas of Colorado, was the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, or RDOF. This Rural Digital Opportunity Fund was a $20 billion with a B dollar initiative to get internet access into parts of the country that don't have any internet access at all. And I've visited some of those places. I've been to Rifle, Colorado, for example. I've been to low-income Alaska Native villages above the Arctic Circle where there are no roads going into the town. I've visited with poor African-American families in the Delta in Mississippi. I've visited with Hispanic families in inner city Los Angeles who don't have the access they need because their neighborhood isn't considered sufficiently profitable for broadband providers to deploy. And so we saw it as our goal at the FCC to change that equation, to direct this funding into unserved parts of the country and enable every American to have what I consider to be digital opportunity. Same thing with promoting innovation, making sure that these new technologies had a chance to grow here in the United States. Massive increase in the amount of spectrum that's available for Wi-Fi, for example, because Wi-Fi was, of course, increasingly important. Encouraging companies to develop technologies from space. Some of you probably heard of the company SpaceX, and there are a number of other companies like that. But for the first time ever, we, over the last couple of years, authorized those companies to deploy service and to deploy these satellites at scale, which is really exciting. The next thing, of course, is consumer protection and public safety and national security. A bunch of different initiatives here, but Dr. Hauser mentioned one of them that's really important to me. The designation of 988 is a 3-digit number for suicide prevention and mental health. People might not realize it, but the suicide rates in the United States have reached an all-time high. We've seen rates now that we haven't seen since World War II. And that's only been accentuated because of the pandemic, with more people staying at home and dealing with mental health difficulties on their own. And one of the things that occurred to me a couple of years ago was that the 11-digit number that is currently allocated for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline might be very difficult to remember. It's 1-800-273-TALK or 273-8255. And working with Congress, what we came up with was a solution. Well, why don't we think about a 3-digit number that's sort of like 911, where if you're struggling late at night or anytime during the day, you won't have to go to your fridge and see what the number is. You'll be able to remember it instantly. Well, that's what we did with 988. 988 is going to be operational across the United States by July of 2022. And I'm really thrilled to see what a difference this is going to make in the lives of so many, especially some of the harder hit communities, veterans, African-American youth, LGBTQ youth, and others who have been disproportionately affected, of course, by the pandemic. And even before that, had a disproportionate share of mental health struggles. So those are the kinds of things you're able to do when you're in the corner office of the FCC. And I have to say, it really gave me a good feeling to roll up my sleeves, metaphorically, going into work and knowing that every day, little by little, we were trying to do something for the American people. It was a privilege of a lifetime to serve. And when I left a couple of months ago, we had a few farewells with the FCC staff, and I told them what I'll tell you, which is that when you work so hard, when you're sprinting for 4 years alongside your coworkers, they become your family. And I can tell you, for any out there who doubt the dedication of public servants, at least as far as the FCC is concerned, you will never find a better group of public servants than those folks at the FCC. They could do so many different things in the private sector, but they've chosen to spend their lives, some of them 40, 50 years at the FCC, to advance the public interest. So if you ever have a chance to stop by Washington, I really encourage you to go to the FCC and just thank some of the career workers that you see there, because they really do care deeply about their mission. And that leads me to the final point I thought I'd close on, which is something that I know CMC has really been focused on over the years, which is how do we ensure that everybody is able to benefit from communications technologies? And more generally, how do we build a culture that is more accepting of the differences that anybody in society naturally has with each other? And as far as CMC itself and what the FCC and others are seeking to do, I think all of us ultimately have the same mission at a very high level, which is to leave society better off tomorrow than it is today. At an educational institution, of course, the goal is to equip you with the critical thinking skills and the raw knowledge that will enable you to be a more productive citizen. At the FCC, my goal was to ensure that every American has access to technologies to enable them to do things like telework and telehealth and remote learning and precision agriculture, all those things that depend on technology. I think our politics, generally speaking, would be healthier if we focused on those things that are really core, I think, at least, to the concerns of the typical American citizen. To me, at least, when I traveled around, I was always struck by how less divisive and less tribalistic the conversations were compared to here in Washington. Here in Washington, for example, when I testified before a congressional hearing, it would typically be politicians lobbing these hostile questions at me. I would respond, and they'd be dissatisfied and follow up with letters, and then there'd be press accounts saying about how divided Washington was. But actually, when you get out there and what I consider to be somewhat the real world outside of the bubble of Washington, you find that there's a lot of commonality. For example, when it comes to things like making sure that people in rural areas have the broadband internet access they need, it's not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue to me or to them. That's an American issue. When you talk about 988 being available, and I talked to veterans groups and I did events with LGBTQ youth groups and others, they don't see it as a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. They see it as an American issue. And I think that's one of the great promises of technology, is that it really can empower everybody to have a voice, to have opportunity. And that's something that benefits all of us. The cliche is a cliche for a reason, because it's true. A rising tide raises all boats. And I tend to share that naive, perhaps, view that ultimately, if everyone has access to technology and is enabled to participate fully in society and the economy, we're all going to be better off. And I think that's the kind of thing, at least, that I tried to model during my time in public service. As for the more general questions about how do we make sure that ours is a culture of diversity and inclusion, and one in which everyone is able to participate, all I can say is what I believe. And to me, at least, I am the product of immigrants, of course, first generation American myself, having been born and brought up here. And to me, I find it amazing that America, almost uniquely among countries in the world and throughout countries in history, has been a place where the chapters are always being written by those who come in the future and by those who are already here. And to me, at least, that's one of the things that makes America special. Yet Matt reflected on our time in Europe, and I think he made a very perceptive point that when we were abroad, it almost helped us build a better understanding of the country we were from. And that's something I've seen in my own travels as well. When I was at the FCC, I had a chance to visit everywhere from Bahrain to Malaysia to India to Israel to Germany. And one of the things you find is that you have a greater appreciation of some of the strengths that we bring to the table as Americans. And first and foremost among them, at least to me, is that we all ultimately should have a chance to succeed. And that's one of the things I'm really passionate about, is just making sure that everyone has a seat at the table. And I know that these are, of course, very divisive times, and social media and other things like that only make it more divisive, because it's very easy to retreat back into your shell or to your camp and think about everybody else as being wrong and your side is right. But at the end of the day, what I'd like to think is that Thomas Jefferson had it right when he said in his first inaugural speech in March of 1801, but every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. And if you think about the context in which he said it, America had just had for its first divisive election, the presidential election of 1800. Federalists and Republicans were at each other's throats. They didn't like each other. And in this inaugural address, what he tried to do was introduce the concept of, look, we might disagree on politics, but politics is not the end all be all of our existence. We are Americans first and foremost. And that's certainly how I see it, which might sound odd, given that I've been in the political arena for the last decade or so. But when politics at its best, I think, is one that brings everybody together and ultimately recedes in importance to some extent from people's lives, so that you can focus on common solutions, which is building a stronger family for yourself, a stronger community for others, and a stronger nation for future generations. So anyway, I know this is in the mode of a filibuster in the grand tradition of Washington, but just wanted to express again my gratitude to CMC for allowing me to have this platform, and really look forward to some lively exchanges with some of our colleagues at CMC and perhaps some of the students out there who might have something that they want to explore. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Ajit. And while you're catching your breath, we had a little bit of feedback on the microphone. It broke up just a little bit, so it got much better toward the end. So I don't know if anything changed there on your end, but just to be aware of that, we might ask you as we go.
Okay.
So questions are starting to come in. Let me give you one so let me invite all my colleagues at Colorado Mountain College, students and faculty and staff, and any of our any of our community members who may be joining us today to please send your questions. We will make sure that we present those to Ajit. Let's start with one that you just finished with, which had to do more with your understanding of sort of partisanship. You were a Republican nominee of President Obama's, who was then promoted, if you will, to the chairperson of the FCC by President Trump. Clearly, given that your unanimous approval by the Senate, widely very popular with everybody for all good reasons. But what can you help us in sort of understanding America today, and us being the recipients of sort of that partisanship and that tribalism and the messages that are coming? What did you learn about bipartisanship, or maybe the distinction between what you hear and see on TV and what the reality is like on the ground? Let me just give one piece of context. What you just mentioned about the staff at the FCC actually touched me. I worked in state government for almost 15 years. And I used to say the same thing, like, yes, our executives sometimes get thrown into these political discussions, but the staff, they're the most hardworking, dedicated. They're the people who are on principle, believe in the work every day. And they may be the only people who really know or are the experts in that work of anybody in the country. And you don't want to lose them. They're the ones who are keeping it together. So thanks for recognizing that sort of hidden part of government. But kind of going back to the question, what did you learn about, again, being a Republican nominee to a Democrat president, and then coming back in what we might characterize as a controversial sort of initial couple of years during the next administration, and sort of what lessons did you learn? What can you share with us as far as how you try to stay above the fray, continue to do the work on behalf of all of America, and sort of the lessons that you experienced?
It's a great question. And I will say it certainly wasn't easy, either in the Obama administration or in the Trump administration, to do the best that we could. And for those of you who don't know, the FCC is an independent agency. Even though we are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, ultimately, we report to ourselves. We don't have to take orders from either the Congress or the White House. And one of the things that was very important to me, especially when I became chairman during the Trump administration, was to lay a very clear marker that we are going to do what we think is correct, even if it upsets Republicans at the White House or Democrats. And that's ultimately why on a few different issues, you might have seen both sides upset with us for different reasons. For example, early on in my tenure as chairman, that we made a decision on net neutrality that was broadly unpopular among many Democrats, but I believed it was the right thing to do. And so we pushed ahead. And ultimately, I think the results speak for themselves in terms of infrastructure investment, the internet remaining open, and a lot of the fears that were raised not being materializing. But at the same time, we did some things that upset the Republicans. And so, for example, I remember very vividly in July of 2018, I was preparing for a congressional hearing the next day, feeling pretty good about it. At 9 p.m. at night, my phone started blowing up, and all these people are texting me, the president just tweeted at you, and like, what? And so I pull up Twitter, and the president had said something to the effect of, in the context of the FCC, I made the decision to block the merger of Sinclair and Tribune, two different broadcast groups, because I just thought it was against the law what they were trying to do and how they were structuring the transaction. And I knew it was going to be unpopular, but among Republicans, but I did it anyway. And so I got a tweet from the president saying something to the effect of, why did the FCC block this merger? It previously allowed other companies to merge, but not this one. Disgraceful! Exclamation point. And it's sort of a surreal thing to be tweeted directly by the president of the United States. But one of the things that I noticed early on in those first couple of years is that when you stand your ground and you do what you believe is the right thing to do, even if, especially if other people disagree with you, over time, they will respect the fact that you're doing it because you believe it's the right thing to do. And so when I left office in January 2021, we did have support among Republicans and Democrats for certain initiatives like rural broadband and 988, but I was almost prouder of the fact that we'd stood up to opposition from each of those sides, because it demonstrated that at the end of the day, the FCC was not putting its finger on the wind. We're trying to put our finger on problems and deliver results for the American people. And I think ultimately, it might sound strange, but I would encourage everybody to just forget about the party labels to the extent you can and focus on what the issues are where there is common interest. Even if it's a Democrat, if you're a Republican, and even if it's a Democrat advancing a policy you might think instinctively, well, I'm not going to support it because that person's a Democrat, or vice versa. Just that doesn't matter at the end of the day. I mean, those folks I meet who are concerned about rural broadband and telehealth and things like that, they genuinely do not care about partisan affiliation at the end of the day. They care about results. And I think our country would be a lot healthier if we could embrace that here in Washington. So anyway, hope that answers the question somewhat. And I can go through, I see there's some questions in the chat too. I can just go through if you like, or whatever you prefer to do, Matt.
So I've been going through here, and there are some, so just to prepare you, I'll ask it next, but there is a question about net neutrality, of course. So you can't avoid that one. That's going to come next, because I said I'd prioritize student questions. So
no, absolutely, happy to do it.
Yeah, Ethan Johnson, who is a business student at CMC, said that, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, said that he's fascinated by information and communication technology, and also leaning, and he's implying information, disinformation, misinformation, and how do we reconcile the issues posed by companies such as Facebook and Twitter censoring and regulating information on their own respective platforms, specifically due to their largeness, their monolithic positions in the communications marketplace. So how do we as a country manage both sort of the volume and what's coming out of these organizations, recognizing that these are private companies, these are not public institutions, and so what's the role, or how do we try to manage that?
Ethan, you touched on one of the most challenging issues in Washington. I think that part of the reason is that these companies, a few of them in particular, really define the public square in many ways. So whether you're talking about a Facebook page where people are debating politics, or Twitter, or the like, or what searches you're able to do on Google. And I think there's a growing recognition in Washington that the marketplace in terms of social media platforms, or just any internet platform, has been generally unregulated. The FCC doesn't have regulatory authority over those companies at all, except with a minor exception of Section 230, which I'd be happy to go into a little bit. But generally speaking, they're under the purview of the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. And the FTC has very broad authority and has generally never regulated these companies directly. And so that's why you see Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill thinking about new legislation to either think about antitrust action with respect to these companies, or some type of other regulation, whether it's privacy or revising Section 230 and the like. And I don't know where that conversation is going to end up, but I think in the near term, the more interesting thing is going to be the FTC or DOJ lawsuits against some of those companies. Google in particular, I think, where they're looking at, does this company have market power? It has 90% market power in terms of search, has the Android platform, it has a pretty dominant platform. And should we think about that presenting a competitive threat to the next Googles, and also to consumers? And also in terms of the misinformation or bad information that goes over those platforms, what's the responsibility of those platforms to moderate that kind of content? And very tricky questions that are going to have to be answered, and they've never really been answered in the digital age. Only in the last year or so have we seen the questions even being confronted. So I don't have a crystal ball that's worth much on these issues, but it's going to be fascinating to see how the Biden White House, by the FCC, and by the new Congress tackle some of those things.
Thanks, Ajit. So I said there is a question around net neutrality. Maybe my interest here. So one is just a question around net neutrality and why you took the position you did on that. Full disclosure, CMC was a signatory to a letter opposing your decision on that. So just be aware. We and probably most colleges did the same. But give us a sense of your stance on that, and also maybe you can also help us understand the kind of negative blowback you got from not only just the corporate side, or maybe the political action groups, but individuals. And I know that there were threats made against you and your family. And so maybe kind of help us understand what that tribalism felt like on your side, and sort of how you managed that.
Yeah, it was quite something. But as to the issue itself, I do stand by the decision we made 100%. And if you look at what we did, so from the inception of the commercial internet in the mid-1990s during the Clinton administration, all the way up until 2015, the first 6 years of the Obama administration, the FCC embraced what was called the Title I approach to the internet. We considered it an information service, which meant that it was a more lightly regulated part of the economy. We allowed the marketplace to develop organically, and then we would take targeted action if there was any anti-competitive conduct. Now, in 2015, of course, the FCC changed course and it decided to regulate the internet under so-called Title II, which is a more utility-style regulation. And my concern with that is that if you regulate something like the utility, like a slow-moving water company or an electric company or Amtrak or whatever, over time, companies are going to be much less likely to raise capital, to build networks, and ultimately to create infrastructure that serves everybody. And we saw infrastructure investment go down in the first couple of years after that decision was made, which is the only time it's happened outside of a recession. So we restored the Title I classification in 2017. And of course, I knew it was going to be opposed, but I think the facts bear out that it was the correct decision. When we made that decision, we saw all kinds of predictions. This is going to be the end of the internet as we know it. You're going to have to pay $14.99 to Twitter per month to be allowed to tweet. Nobody's going to be able to access the internet anymore. You're going to be blocked from accessing websites. And none of that has come to pass. To the contrary, fiber deployment in the United States set a record in 2018, a record that was broken in 2019. 87,000 new wireless cell sites deployed across the country, especially in rural areas over the last couple of years. And moreover, from a network operator perspective, the internet remains free and open. Indeed, if there's any threat to an open internet, it actually comes from those social media platforms that are increasingly deciding what people can say and what people see and what they don't can say and what they can't see. So I do think we made the correct decision. And to me at least, the proof in the pudding has been whenever I look on Twitter and people are debating this, like, hey, why did we hate that guy again back in 2017? Or what was this issue all about? Did anything ever happen with that? And to me, that's sort of proof positive. Oh, and I forgot the best stat. I completely forgot this one. So the number of people said that speeds were going to slow down after we made this decision. From December 14th of 2017 until today, speeds have more than doubled for fixed broadband in the United States, which you wouldn't expect if that prediction way back when had been proven true. So I think part of the issue as well that lingers for me is, as you hinted, Matt, in the second part of your question was some of the blowback. And, I knew it was going to be a controversial decision. That was a no-brainer. I knew there were going to be people who opposed me, including some dear friends. And that's part of what political debate is all about. I don't mind that. What I do mind is that when it gets exceptionally personal, verging on racist and threatening and the like. And it was kind of daunting. I remember still vividly being in my office in, I can't remember if it was late 2017 or early 2018, sitting there doing my work and getting a few emails, and in particular, 3 emails in a row from this guy. And one said, had a picture of me with my family. It was in my office. The next one had a list of preschool addresses. My son was in preschool at the time in our neighborhood in Arlington, Virginia, where I live. And then the third one was, I've got a weapon, a gun, and I'm coming to hunt your kids. And that was, when you're just kind of, you never expect something like that, and you've got to take it seriously because this is, if you remember, a few months after the Scalise shooting and the Congressional Baseball Club shooting, and you never know, there are some crazy people out there. And so for the rest of the year, my son couldn't take the school bus to kindergarten, and he would always ask why. My wife had some, it was a terrible time. Unmarked packages at the house, my in-laws getting calls at 3 in the morning, cursing them out for no reason. I think, and this is not just a Republican thing, I can tell you. I've had friends who served in Democratic administrations who've gotten the same kind of blowback. And to me, at least, it speaks to the very worst, I think, of the American id, which is to find someone you disagree with and just use any means necessary, including threats, actual or verbalized, to get your way. And so when this individual who sent those 3 emails was ultimately arrested and sentenced to prison, the court asked me for an opinion about what his sentence should be. And I said, well, look, I defer to the court on that. But what I will say is that when the FBI arrested him, he stood by what he said as a means of trying to get me to change my mind. And I said that this can't be how America functions, because after I'm gone, there's going to be another FCC chair, and that person is going to have to make a difficult decision that he or she believes is right. And do you really want a situation in which he or she has to factor into his or her decision making? Boy, my family might get threatened because of this, or my parents are going to get attacked. It's just not the way we want people to make these decisions. So, politics aside, I would hope that this is something that never has to be visited on anyone. I certainly am glad it's in the rear view mirror for myself, and I can now focus on the path ahead, which is a much more optimistic one.
It was painful for us, your friends who are watching a lot of that happening to Ajit. So many of us felt like saying, but if you only knew him, how wonderful he is, like, please.
And that's a funny thing. Funny you should mention that, not to take the microphone back, but I would do these town halls, especially around college campuses and other places when I was in office. And I can tell you every single time from SMU to Yale, wherever across the country I would do them, a student or two or three or maybe 10 would come up and say afterward, wow, you're actually kind of nice, or wow, you're sort of thoughtful about these issues. Oh, we've never heard these arguments before. And to me, that was one of the great tragedies about it. It's like, if I wish I could have spread myself across all of these different fora so I could interact with everybody, because then you would understand that it really is just kind of an arcane, boring telecom question. It's not a life or death question for Americans. And also I think there's something to the fact that because of the internet now, people are disintermediated, and there's also anonymity. And so you just feel more, there's a much greater tendency to be harsh towards other people who you don't know. There's something to seeing somebody in the flesh and looking them eye to eye, and just it kind of forces you to understand their point of view better. And I've certainly learned from you and others that way. And I wish I could have communicated that way to millions of others too, who might have been opposed to me.
It was certainly hard to watch at times. So maybe shifting gears a little bit, but maybe it's a philosophical question. And by the way, our psychology professors and our political theorists appreciated you using the term American id. I'm not sure that has ever been used. That Freudian concept has ever been used in this discussion. Thank you for that. So a question was, is the internet a basic right, a human right? Is it like electricity and water? Is this something we should interpret in that context?
To me, at least, the way I've thought about it is always that every American who wants access to the internet should be able to get it. And I don't know whether you call it a right, an entitlement, a necessity. But to me, at least, the pandemic has ended any debate about whether or not it's a luxury or necessity. To me, it's a necessity. I mean, I think, especially as the pandemic unfolded in March and April of 2020, when you had hundreds of millions of Americans now shifting to a stay-at-home, work-from-home environment, the internet was quite literally many people's connection to the outside world. And so if they didn't have it, they weren't going to be able to do their jobs as well. Their kids weren't going to be able to do remote learning. If they didn't want exposure to a healthcare provider in a bricks and mortar healthcare facility, they wouldn't be able to use telehealth solutions. For farmers and ranchers, I imagine there might be many among those viewers on this call. A lot of agriculture now requires precision agriculture, which is essentially the application of technology to the farms and ranches around the country. You can't do that if you don't have access to that technology. So to me, I've always, and I don't know where this puts me on the political spectrum, but I just think that every family and every community, our country is better off when everyone has access to this technology. And so, that's basically how I see it. And I don't know, I can tell you that when you travel around the world and you see how people's lives can be improved so materially through access to it, I mean, it just makes such a big difference. And, just a quick vignette, I remember very briefly, a couple of years ago, having a very meaningful visit to this dusty village outside of Bangalore, India, where my mom is from. And I went there in an official capacity. And I remember meeting on this rooftop where that morning, 20 women were getting, for the first time, loans from the Grameen Bank, which those of you who might know it, they give microloans to very poor individuals in developing countries to enable them to start businesses. Well, a lot of these women didn't have access to technology with the exception of a phone. They had their phones, which enabled them to receive and give payments. And to watch the look on their faces when for the first time they were able to get these microloans over their phones, so they controlled it, their husbands or other family members didn't control it. It was the most empowering thing I've ever seen. And these were women who were going to start businesses that they controlled, that provided value to them and a sense of meaning to them. Just one vignette, I think, illustrates that everybody who wants access to technology can do incredible things with it. And again, here too, it's not a Republican issue or Democratic issue. It's just an American issue, global issue, frankly. And yeah, I wish more people would see it that way. Sorry to get on the soapbox there.
You're here to be on the soapbox, so we encourage it. So a couple of our, well, one of our faculty members, actually a political science faculty member, Bob, wrote about what you're thinking on the reinstatement of the fairness doctrine for de-escalation of hyperpartisanship of the media. There were several other similar questions throughout about balanced presentation or objective presentation of information and where we can find that, given that it is polarized, like a lot of the news is so polarized right now, or the media sources. What's your opinion? What can be done about this, and what ideas do you have, and maybe how we might improve the access to objective, fair information in the United States?
What a tough issue this is, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure the questioner and many of you have probably had this experience when you talk to family or friends. Sometimes they'll come up with an opinion just based on something they saw on Facebook or some email chain that was forwarded from 40 people and came to you through your uncle, and then just crazy things like this. You just sometimes wonder, like, how on earth can you possibly, I mean, you seem like a rational, reasoned person. How can you believe this? And essentially, where you stand depends on what you watch and what you consume. And that's part of the reason why, in our house at least, we just don't watch cable TV of any stripe, because so much of it now, when you flip around the channels, so much of it is driving a particular agenda or relying on narratives that are just not factually based. And that's just a private solution for one family. On a macro level, I think the difficulty is it is very difficult to draw these lines. For example, the fairness doctrine, which you mentioned, or which the questioner mentioned, was jettisoned in 1987 in part by the FCC, in part because it was increasingly difficult to draw the lines about what is allowed and what's not. And I think in the modern age, that's one of the challenges I have for these digital platforms. Number one, there are First Amendment protections for these private platforms. The FCC, the federal government generally, cannot say you can publish this, you can't publish that, you can broadcast this, but not that. But secondly, even beyond that, I think it gives regulators or policymakers a lot of power to be able to decide what people are allowed to say and what they aren't. And I know it's a very dissatisfactory solution or conclusion to say that the government shouldn't have any role in here, but I ultimately think that the role of line drawing is a really dangerous one that we've often disregarded or not gone down the road of in this country, and for good reason. And I know it's cacophonous, but at the end of the day, I'm almost more worried about a government that's sitting in judgment of what people are allowed to say and not than the converse. And so to me, then the question becomes, well, how do you address the challenge? And the only thing I can think of is for people with institutional responsibility and expertise, people like CMC, for example, or my successor at the FCC, or people in Congress, anybody, to really beat the drum in favor of more fact-based, sober decision-making. When it comes to COVID-19, for example, one of the things that I was perplexed by in the early days was this misinformation that was perpetuating on Facebook and other places about 5G, the next generation of wireless connectivity, somehow causing COVID-19 or increasing its rate of spread. And you saw people taking action on that, torching wireless towers, attacking company vehicles and things like that. And so I told my team that my team didn't want to acknowledge this, but I said, we've got to say something to make clear that this is a nonsense conspiracy theory. And so we put out a statement where I said, look, 5G has nothing whatsoever to do with COVID-19. If anything, 5G is a part of the solution because it could allow telehealth or other types of wireless technologies to be used for the benefit of patients. And that's the sort of thing that I think people in positions of responsibility have to do to try to tamp that down some of that misinformation. But it's hard. I don't envy the task of college administrators like you or government officials like I used to be. It's like a tsunami of misinfo that's always coming at us, I feel like.
I have experienced quite a lot of that too in my time at the Capitol. So this question, there are several questions that have come in with this theme. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. The theme has more to do with sort of the vitriol between Democrats and Republicans in this ideological debate around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and cancel culture, and sort of this concept of, should there be restrictions on certain types of training or certain types of education or ways of thinking, including critical race theory, systemic racism, things of that nature. I recognize it's not your role as FCC to have an opinion or as an attorney in this area, But as a person who's in the middle of that, like you were a part of, at least within DC and certainly part of the communication side of a lot of these discussions. What might you take from your experiences that can help inform how we think about, and maybe it's even personal, how we approach and create an environment where there is an expectation of a fair dialogue, of balanced views, of openness to different opinions. And this may be, again, more personal and less about your professional background, but there's a number of questions in here regarding your experience in working between the parties and sort of the communications thereof, and the most recent examples of sort of these this push and pull between more sort of inclusivity type training and then those that are strongly opposed to any pursuit of that. How can you help us as a college as we approach this? And again, as Carrie mentioned at the beginning, a lot of what we're looking at now is truly trying to be open to every student, and that means every, whatever their partisan or their political backgrounds, whatever their socioeconomic circumstances, whatever their citizenship or immigration status. Like we want to wrap our arms around all of those students and provide an environment where they can be successful. How can you help us along that path, and maybe experiences that you've had, or things that have worked from your experience?
Those are terrific points, so, and an important question too, Matt. And I think the way you described it is certainly the way I embraced my role as the leader of an agency of 1,400 people with a wide diversity of experiences and backgrounds. And that is to really wrap my arms around everybody, and to the maximum extent I could. And part of it involves making sure that when I was at the FCC, we cast a broad net in terms of who we are recruiting to join the agency. And so, for example, I started an early career staff diversity initiative because I recognized that students, especially those who tended to be from minority or underserved communities, might not have the funds that are able to be able to do an unpaid internship at the FCC, might be dissuaded from joining the FCC at all. And so we started a stipend program to allow people from disadvantaged backgrounds to be able to afford to work at the FCC. We also stepped up our outreach to historically Black colleges and universities and other institutions like that, so that people would think of the FCC when they were looking for a job in the telecom or tech sectors. Similarly, when it came to diversity of backgrounds, of educational backgrounds, we wanted to cast a wide net as well. Over time, what I found was the FCC had become kind of the province of lawyers. We just tended to have an increasing percentage of lawyers, and nothing against lawyers, I'm one of them as well. But to me, at least, that makes the ultimate end product less informed if you don't have people from a variety of disciplines. So we started an honors engineering program to bring in some of the best and brightest engineers, and also an economics program as well to hire economists. And we also uplifted some of the data scientists and other non-traditional professionals at the FCC to enable all of them to have a seat at the table. And then, part of it also was just, I knew that I just had to lead by example. And I know this is going to sound cheesy to you or maybe others who are watching, but it was really important to me when I went into the office. This is pre-COVID, of course, before we went virtual. But it was really important to me to make a concerted effort to, number one, show up, and number two, treat every single individual I ever saw with the utmost respect. And I think that if you were to ask anybody at the FCC today, without me around, what they thought of what I was like as a leader, they would say, wow, he actually cared about us a lot. He was the one who showed up to African-American employee recognition events. He was the one who spoke Spanish from the heart at some of the Hispanic employee events. He was the one who talked at the Veterans Day events about how important it was to him to make sure that we included veterans. He was the one that, in terms of accessibility, made sure that not just technologies, but the FCC was, the physical space of the FCC was more accessible to those with disabilities. You should talk to security officers, who I made sure that they were recognized. I would come in late at night sometimes just to make sure they knew I had their back. Or the people who worked in the parking lots, who taught me Amharic, and I knew their families and their kids by name. I mean, just things. I think it's so important for leaders to take down the temperature from some of this vitriol. And one easy way to do it, I know it sounds ridiculous, just to be good to each other. And what you're going to find is that even if people who you encounter then come to the table with some pretty strong opinions, they're going to tend to moderate the way they express those opinions because they know you're coming from a position of good faith. And you conversely are going to be more understanding about those opinions because you'll know, like, look, this person might have what I think is a crazy opinion, but he or she is coming from a position of good faith as well. And I think part of the problem nowadays is that we just tend to assume the worst because of whatever category we assign to a particular individual based on who they look or where they come from, or what their class status and all that kind of thing. And I think we would do a lot better to focus on what those kinds of commonalities, and that requires a tremendous amount of effort, but it's worth it at the end of the day. I have followed a lot of these questions about training controversies and the like, and we haven't had those issues at the FCC. I'm happy to say, at least when I was there, we didn't, because we made it clear that we want everybody to have the chance to be here and to succeed when they're here. And again, I think that regardless of background, people would say that we did a good job of that.
Thanks, Ajit. We are very near the end, so I'm going to see if we can. Actually, there's so many questions that are highly technical. We have even a student asked you about blockchain technology. So
yeah, that's awesome.
Why don't I end with in 2 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to Carrie to close us out on time. What's the future of telecommunications? Sort of what are you most excited about as you look ahead? And what are you hopeful for as we start to experience with this, the next generation of communications, maybe broadband or whatever is the future? What do you see on the horizon that we should be paying attention to?
Well, I'm certainly very excited about the prospect of, as I said at the outset, every American getting access to these technologies. But what I'm particularly excited about over the next 5 to 10 years is how these technologies are going to be applied. The future of healthcare, for example, is so exciting as you see the model of healthcare being inverted, where you happen to be given service depends on where you are, not where the physician or the other healthcare provider is. And so, for example, if you're able to have a wearable that follows you around if you're a diabetic, and it can monitor your vital signs so that a provider can intervene before a problem materializes into an emergency, that'll be tremendously beneficial. Things like that to patients across the country. Same thing in fields such as agriculture. I mean, I know it's not what you think about when you think about technology, but I'm telling you, I've been to a lot of these farms and ranches, and to the extent that we can get them all connected with things like 5G, Internet of Things, or IoT solutions, we're going to see much more productive farms that are much more environmentally sustainable, that produce a lot more for cheaper, better food and the like. And that part of it is really exciting to me as well. And some of these other things in terms of automation are going to be very exciting. Transportation networks, for example, that dramatically reduce the incidence of car wrecks because each car will be connected and will be able to sense the other ones. I mean, that's the kind of thing that will save some of the 36,000 lives that are lost every single year to car crashes. So I think some of those verticals, as people in the industry call it, are really exciting to see. And I just hope I have a chance to see all of it in action. It's a really exciting inflection point, and hopefully CMC graduates and others will be able to pioneer it.
Thanks, Ajit. It is a privilege to have you with us today. I'll turn it over to Carrie momentarily, but also to say to everybody who's with us today that Ajit, we've already invited him to come in person after we are post-COVID. We'll find an event where we can spend a little bit more time personally with him and can ask all these questions, these great questions that are coming up about the future of telecommunications. And Ajit and I learned I was trying to remember while you were talking the salutation that we learned when we were in Hungary, but I'll do my best to say "Sheg de Shegere," however that was. It was like good health to you as we were enjoying libations in Budapest. So it's wonderful to have you, my friend. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to President Hauser.
Thanks so much.
Thanks to Matt. Again, thanks to our committee and to Richard Gonzalez and so many that brought Ajit to us today. We were delighted to have you, and it's always a good testament when you leave lots of questions on the table that our students, our faculty, our community members were certainly interested in. It seems to me that we do have a 2.0 visit in your future. I just would close by saying that part of the reason that we asked Ajit to join us today was that we do look at and listen to the feedback that you all send us. And we did get some feedback about either perceived or real leanings of some of the speakers that we'd have, or perhaps a trend, and to open that up quite a bit. So we will continue to try to even understand our own blind spots, and make sure that we have opportunities for dialogue of various different sorts with lots of different individuals with different perspectives. So Ajit, you performed in spades today. We are so delighted to have you be a friend of Colorado Mountain College, and we invite you to our backyard anytime. And look forward to seeing you sometime in the future. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. We did record this, and we'll figure out how to make it available, and certainly invite our faculty and staff to coffee and conversations on April 16th. Ajit, a final word. You get it.
Oh, well, yeah, Carrie, Dr. Hauser, I should say, thanks so
Carrie,
much.
please. Yeah.
Thanks so much for having me. And I apologize to those on the chat whose questions I wasn't able to answer, but I really appreciate the dialogue and look forward to staying in touch in the future. And who knows, maybe this fall, when the Kansas City Chiefs resume their march towards what I hope is another Super Bowl championship, we can all meet together in Colorado and talk about how everybody at CMC should be a Kansas City fan. But more seriously, I look forward to seeing you in person one of these days, and you continue the conversation. It means a lot to me that you reached out, and means even more that there's so much positive engagement. Keep up the great work, Carrie, and everybody at CMC. And
them are fighting words. I lived in Kansas City for a couple of years and had to hide my orange. So we will take you on. And there was a question about whether that's a real Heisman Trophy behind you. So
yeah, so it's not. My in-laws are part of a very vicious fantasy football league. And so the winner over the last 10 years has gotten this trophy with his or her name inscribed on it. And so I'm the defending champion, which is why, thanks in part to a number of key performances in week 16, I was able to bring the trophy home. So little known fact, I do have the athletic prowess, of course, to have made it in the NFL, but I chose to focus my career on communications regulation instead. So pretty much the fantasy gridiron is where I make my mark these days.
It's good for us to all recognize our own skill sets. So congratulations on that dubious honor. And again, we just so grateful that you spent time with our community today, and we wish you well in DC, and we look forward to seeing you in person. And again, thanks to Matt for great facilitation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Best wishes to all of you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.